World War II, Henry VIII, Agincourt and the Great Fire of London, just some of the historic moments that you probably learnt about in school. But my next guest thinks there's more to history than we read in textbooks and has made it his mission to showcase it. Alex Deane is the author of Lessons from History, a look at some of the obscure moments of the past. The former Conservative Party aide wrote the book during lockdown and was a social media hit with his weird and wonderful historic tales. So ahead of schools heading back to the classroom in September, is it time to rethink the history curriculum? Alex joins me in the studio to discuss that very question. I loved following your Twitter feed and your historical nuggets. They kept so many people entertained, delighted at this nation's history. And there's a lot to enjoy. I mean, it's a huge, rich tapestry of events.
There is, but I fear, actually, as you were talking in your introduction about our school curriculum, that people are going to get rather less than you described, rather than more. I might want people to explore the stories that have been neglected in our education, but the education that people are getting now, I fear, is increasingly taught by people and increasingly guided by people who think that this generation has a monopoly on wisdom, and that everyone who came before us is some various shade of bigot whose statues got to be torn down, and we live in a kind of glorious year zero. So there was, I confess, a bit of, in amongst the jokiness of the history stories which I love telling, there was a bit of an attempt to point to the wisdom of our forebears, because I fear, as you were talking about Henry VIII and Agincourt and so forth, I worry that's not getting taught now. I worry that's actually not the kind of thing people get in their history lessons.
Is this modern craze about essentially repoliticising the past, using past battles and past prejudices and past behaviours which are totally out of sync with today's world, but then retrospectively trying to make them relevant to today, which will only fuel a sort of sense of hating the country or thinking there's something inherently wrong with Britain's past?
And I think that's an attitude that is uniquely shown in this country. In most other countries, people look at their history, they might say warts and all, but they find the things to cherish. They believe in having heroes and champions. They believe in having those that they will literally put on pedestals and say, here was a good man or woman whose example we can follow. But in our country, almost uniquely, we've got a set of intellectuals who seem to hate Britain and hate what it stands for. Well, I don't, and if that's your perspective, you probably shouldn't read this.
Why has it become such a fashion to do down our ancestors, to do down our heritage, to constantly talk about colonialism as if it was just one giant succession of pure evil, and not actually discuss things like the benefits it might have brought the world, and actually not represent the fact that standards and mores of the past are naturally going to be different, and you have to be, to a degree, culturally relativist when it comes to assessing history?
So I'll try and answer your question straight. I think some people want to view history like that because they want to judge us in boxes. They want to put individuals into, you are this colour and therefore you are like this. You are this sex and therefore you are like that. And if you do that, and if you pursue that path, then you start judging the past on that basis too. And you start evaluating everything based on the notion that you must be assigned into a particular area. Whereas, in fact, I think our history teaches us that we're a very welcoming, open-minded, multicultural, tolerant nation that's done a great deal of good around the world. Now, that doesn't mean you should ignore some of the wrong things that have happened, and there were many bad things that happened during the colonial period, and I wouldn't brush over it. But as I talk about in the book, Britain pioneering attempts to stop slavery, whilst, for example, the Spanish and the Portuguese were still selling slaves and still exporting slaves from Africa into their colonies in the Americas. Well, you'll find the Spanish don't beat themselves up. The Portuguese don't beat themselves up over their legacy, even though they were wrong and we were right. So we're in this very peculiar situation now, where the country that was on the right side of history, on a big issue people like to talk about at the moment, is uniquely doing itself down. And the countries that were in the wrong don't seem to care.
Is there a risk, though, that it can go the other way when analysing history? I mean, I actually did history up to A-level, all those gazillions of years ago. And up until sort of GCSE, I largely remember learning kings and queens and chronologies and things like that. And then actually, I think GCSE talked about Russia, actually, which we're talking about today. I think we did the Russian Revolution. Then my A-level was just bonkers. It was the Spanish economy in the 18th century or something, you know, obscure. Is there, the way we're teaching history at school, is there a risk that we either sort of just teach people facts and it becomes almost cartoonish, one's perception of the heritage of the country? Would you advocate actually having a real deep dive and very UK-centric focus in the classroom that paints a more rich picture of what society was like, to see how we got to today.
So it's not a new argument, and the Tory party, back when I worked for it, discussed having a review of the history curriculum that Andrew Roberts was going to lead, and it came to nothing because Tony Blair was dominant in the polls. But I would say we should dig that up and get it again, because having a certainty about the basics is what you need at the beginning. You've got to get an understanding, I think, of the basics, but on the other hand, let's not do down the obscure. I'm very fond of the obscure, as my stories have shown.
Yeah, no, let's talk about this book. It's an utter treasure. In writing it, what were the bits you just loved discovering and writing about, that you were just excited to share with the world?
Well, the great thing about the 21st century social media environment, without which this book would not have been written, is that my readers were asking me to do stories that they loved. And if one person put their hand up and they'd been following Deane Histories online and they were enjoying it, then chances were that someone else would as well. So I learnt a great deal as I was writing it. It was crowdsourced, and given my spelling and some of the things I got wrong, it was crowd-edited. And then it came to these fantastic publishers at Bite Back who kindly put it together and were much more professional than me in putting it into one place. But I was excited by the enthusiasm that the people I was talking to had about history. I started doing this as a distraction for myself. I had no idea that it was incredibly flattering to have the millions of readers online that it has had. And so that, for me, has been the great part, finding out what other people were interested in and then being privileged enough to tell the story and get to put it in a book as well.
And if you could teleport yourself back to one era of British history, where are you going and why?
Oh, I think it's very hard to look past our darkest hour and to see the determination of our country as it's still alone. And I think that if you think about our country from Dunkirk on, if you think about Britain during the Battle of Britain and some remarkable moments of heroism, I think that is something that, whilst incredibly dangerous, it's incredibly privileged to think about that greatest generation and the debt that we owe them. It seems that we traduce that rather a lot. Let's not forget, some of them are still with us. Some of them are still remembering the fight that they did and the sacrifice that they made. And I would love to, not without being flippant about it, because it was incredibly dangerous and incredibly hard for people, that's what I would like to see.
And if you were going to avoid or wipe out a century, what was our ugliest part of our nation's history?
I don't know if it's just Britain, but the 14th century is pretty bad all round. There's almost nothing good that comes out of it. There's a lot of plagues, there's a lot of misery. Quality of life ain't great. Probably the troubled 14th.
But, you know, I cannot wait to read your book. It's really up my street, and it's so lovely having someone who has such a passion in our history and sharing that passion with us. And
thank you.
Quite agree. It's time to get the world, not the world, but our world, the UK world, excited about what we are. Here you are, Alex Deane, isn't he fantastic? And I think we've got a good close-up of the book, so you should go out and buy it at once. And Alex, before you go, would you consider this a sort of sit-down long read, or is it what my dad would rather ungainfully call a bog book?
This is definitely aimed at the stocking filler Lou read. There's 94 stories in here, not many of them more than 2 pages long. It's a quick flip.
There you are, that answers my question.